All right, so today we're really diving deep into some serious military strategy, and with none other than the legend himself, Carl von Clausewitz.
You can't talk strategy without Clausewitz, right? Even though he was writing back in the 19th century, his On War, it's still like the Bible for military minds today.
Yeah, it's required reading at practically every war college. And speaking of, for you, our listener out there on the front lines, we're tackling two crucial chapters, Book 6, Chapters 2 and 3 to be exact, to really break down what Clausewitz had to say about offensive and defensive strategies.
And not just the big picture stuff, but how these ideas actually play out when you're, in the thick of it.
Okay, so Clausewitz, right off the bat, he lays out these three core elements that he thinks often determine who wins on the battlefield. Surprise, using the terrain, and attacking from multiple directions. But here's the twist. He argues that usually it's the defense that has the upper hand in these situations, which, I don't know about you, but that seems a little counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does go against what a lot of people would assume. But think of it this way. A defense, it thrives on those unexpected moves, those sudden bursts of strength, or when you can use the terrain to your advantage to keep the enemy guessing. A huge surprise attack, sure, it's powerful, but it's a one-time thing. Defense, though, it lets you have these smaller surprises throughout the whole fight, keeping the pressure on constantly.
He's got this great analogy where he says old school defenses, they were like a piece of work on an embroidery frame, all spread out, vulnerable. But the way he saw modern defense developing, it was about concentrated force, choosing your moment to strike.
Exactly, and that feeds right into his points about using the terrain. Defense, inherently, you've got home field advantage, you can use the terrain for cover, to blend in, to funnel the enemy where you want them. And Clausewitz, he's not just talking about hills and rivers, he's saying any feature of the ground can be used to your advantage if you know how.
And that's got to be huge for someone in the military, right? Knowing the terrain inside and out, that's power. But then he takes it a step further and says, even on a larger strategic level, defense is the stronger position, which sounds kind of crazy at first.
It does seem counterintuitive. He really digs into this in Chapter 3, and a few key things stand out. First off, defenders, they've got the benefit of established infrastructure fortresses, supply lines that are already set up, maybe even the support of the local population. Those are really tough things for an attacker to set up and maintain, especially over time.
So, like, literally defending your own backyard, you've got that advantage. He also talks about those lines of communication, how messing them up for the enemy becomes even more important in the overall war than in just one battle.
Yeah, if you can cut off the enemy's supplies, their reinforcements, even their information, that can be absolutely devastating long term. Clausewitz, he says that as an attack goes on, eventually the attackers have to take up defensive positions to hold what they've taken, and that's when those weaknesses start to show.
So it's like the longer an offensive goes on, the more it becomes a defensive operation in some ways. And he uses Napoleon invading Russia in 1812 as the ultimate cautionary tale of this.
Oh, Napoleon in Russia, that's like the textbook example. His army wasn't just beaten by battles, but by trying to keep those supply lines going over such a vast hostile territory. It was a logistical nightmare.
And it really highlights how even a super strong attack can fall apart if you don't plan for those long-term strategic realities.
It really goes to show you can't just brute force your way to victory. You got to have the strategy to back it up.
And that's where Clausewitz is thinking about defense. It really flips the script on how we usually think about these things.
Absolutely. And he doesn't just stop at the tactical level either. He connects this back to like the whole psychology of being on the offensive versus the defensive.
Right. He talks about how being on the attack often creates this sense of what he calls high spirit, which sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, it's like that feeling of superiority, of confidence, of being unstoppable. And when you're on the attack, that can be a huge motivator for your troops, right? But Clausewitz, being the sharp strategist he was, he also warns that this high spirit, it can be fleeting, like a sugar rush.
It gives you that initial boost, but then you crash.
Exactly. And not only can it fade, but Clausewitz also argues that this feeling of invincibility, it can actually be dangerous, because it can lead to recklessness, to underestimating your opponent, to not properly preparing for the inevitable setbacks that come with any conflict.
Which kind of brings us back to the defender's advantage, right?
Yeah.
They may not have that same initial rush of confidence, but there's a different kind of resolve there.
Absolutely. Think about it.
Yeah.
They're fighting for something. They already have their home, their resources, their people. That's a powerful motivator. And when you combine that with the strategic advantages that we've already talked about, knowing the terrain, having established supply lines, It creates a force that's incredibly tough to beat.
So when we look at it from that angle, it makes sense why Clausewitz ultimately says that from a strategic point of view, defense is the stronger form of war. But how does he define strategic success? I mean, if it's not just about winning individual battles, then what is it about?
That's a great question, and this is where Clausewitz's genius really comes through. He says strategic success, it's twofold. First, it's about creating the conditions for tactical victories.
Setting the stage, so to speak.
Precisely. The better your overall strategy, the more likely you are to win those individual battles. But then Clausewitz takes it a step further. He says strategic success is also about what you do after a victory.
So it's not just about winning, it's about what you do with that win.
Exactly. It's about maximizing the impact of that victory, using it to achieve your larger goals.
Right.
Because a single victory in itself doesn't win the war.
It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. He's talking about creating a ripple effect where one victory leads to another, and another ultimately achieving your overall strategic objectives. And to do that, he highlights a few key principles, like we talked about, using the terrain, achieving surprise but on a larger scale, and then things like the role of fortresses.
Which he says are much more useful for the defender. Right.
Exactly. Because think about it, when you're on the offensive, you're constantly moving further away from your base of support, from your supply lines, from potentially even reinforcements. You're stretching those lines of communication thinner and thinner. Whereas the defender, they're sitting pretty, relatively speaking.
Holding down the fort, literally.
Right. They're fighting on familiar ground, close to their resources, and maybe even getting support from the local population. It all adds up.
It's like we were talking about before, that home field advantage. And this goes back to Napoleon in Russia too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Napoleon's campaign, as ambitious as it was, it ultimately failed because of those overextended supply lines, that lack of local support.
Not to mention that brutal Russian winter.
Exactly. All those things played a role. And Clausewitz uses this example to show that even the most powerful offense, if it doesn't take these long-term strategic factors into account, it can crumble. It all goes back to this key difference between offense and defense. Any offensive, if it doesn't get a quick, decisive win, it's going to have to switch to a defensive posture eventually.
You got to hold the ground you've taken.
Exactly. And as soon as that happens, the attacker, they become vulnerable to all the same challenges as the defender, securing supplies, keeping morale up, dealing with a potentially hostile population.
So in a way, even the most successful attack, it carries within it the seeds of a future defense.
That's a really interesting way to put it, and I think it's a crucial insight from Clausewitz. He's saying that whether you're planning an attack or a defense, you have to be thinking several steps ahead, It's not about rigidly sticking to one approach, but about constantly adapting to the changing circumstances of war.
Being flexible, thinking on your feet.
Exactly. And that's where a deep understanding of those core principles of offense and defense, that's where it becomes so important. Because it's not just about memorizing rules, it's about really internalizing those concepts so they become second nature.
So you can make the right call, even under pressure.
Precisely. Clausewitz, he gives you the framework to understand these complex dynamics of warfare. But it's up to each individual leader to take those principles and use them effectively in the real world.
He gives you the tools, but you got to know how to use them.
Exactly. And that takes experience, judgment, and a deep understanding not only of your own strengths and weaknesses, but of your opponents as well.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into Clausewitz's ideas on offense and defense, what's like the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with? Like, if they only remember one thing from this whole conversation, what would it be?
If I had to pick just one thing, it'd be this. Warfare is never static. It's constantly changing, a constant back and forth between opposing forces. And to succeed, you need to be adaptable.
You got to be able to roll with the punches.
Exactly. You need to understand the subtleties of both offense and defense and be ready to switch gears at a moment's notice. That's what Clausewitz teaches us.
It's about staying one step ahead, anticipating what your opponent might do, and always having a plan B, C, and D ready to go.
Absolutely. And as Clausewitz reminds us, no matter how much we plan and prepare, there's always going to be that element of the unknown in war. The human element, the unpredictable nature of conflict, those are things you can never fully control.
Which is why that adaptability, that ability to think on your feet, is so crucial.
Exactly. And for all of you listening out there facing those challenges every day, we thank you for your service. And we hope this deep dive into Clausewitz's ideas has given you some new things to think about, new ways to approach those challenges.
Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power, right? The more you understand these intricacies of military strategy, the better equipped you'll be to handle whatever comes your way on the battlefield. Until next time, stay safe out there and keep those strategic minds sharp. It's like they say in basketball, gotta stay agile. But in all seriousness, when Clausewitz talks about the psychology of war, that high spirit he mentions, it makes you realize how much of a mental game this all is too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think for anyone who's actually been in combat, felt that intensity firsthand, you see how quickly those emotions, the adrenaline, it takes over. And Clausewitz, he's saying those feelings, they can be powerful, but if you're not careful, they can lead you to make bad decisions.
So it's about finding that balance, right, between acting on instinct and thinking strategically. Easier said than done in the heat of the moment, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure. That's what separates the good leaders from the great ones. Being able to make those split-second calls while still keeping the bigger picture in mind.
And it makes me think about how Clausewitz, he's really clear that there's no magic formula for winning a war.
No silver bullet, that's for sure. Every conflict is different. Every battlefield has its own challenges. Every enemy, they've got their own strengths and weaknesses. That's why he keeps stressing how important it is to constantly be assessing the situation, adjusting your strategy, because what works one day might not work the next.
You got to be able to think on your feet, right? Roll with the punches.
Exactly. And that's where really knowing those fundamentals of offense and defense, the stuff we've been breaking down, that's what makes all the difference. It's not about just memorizing a bunch of rules. It's about understanding these ideas so deeply that they're just ingrained in you.
So when you're out there under pressure, you can
Yeah.
make the tough calls.
Exactly. Clausewitz, he gives you the framework, the big picture, but it's up to each letter to take those principles and put them into practice in the real world.
He gives you the tools, but you got to know how to use them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It takes experience, good judgment, and a deep understanding not just of your own side's strengths and weaknesses, but the enemy's too.
Knowing yourself and your enemy. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Clausewitz on offense and defense, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with? What's that golden nugget of wisdom?
If I had to pick just one thing, it'd be this. Warfare, it's not a static thing. It's constantly moving and changing, this back and forth struggle. And to be successful, you have to be able to adapt. That's what Clausewitz teaches us.
Got to be able to adjust to whatever gets thrown at you.
Absolutely. And he reminds us no matter how much planning, how much preparation we do, there's always that element of the unknown in war. The human element, the unpredictability, those are things you can't control.
Which makes that adaptability, that quick thinking even more important.
Without a doubt. And to everyone listening out there facing these challenges, thank you for your service, and we hope this deep dive into Clausewitz has given you some new insights, some things to consider.
Because as we always say, knowledge is power. The more you understand about strategy, the better prepared you'll be for whatever comes your way on the battlefield. Stay safe out there, everyone, and keep those strategic minds sharp. We'll see you next time.